Thank you, Merrijoy, for that lovely introduction. I'm clearly a senior fellow at a lot of places, which means I'm past tense almost. I wanted to thank the Senior College for the invitation today and to all of you for participating in the midst of our continuing efforts to adapt to COVID-19. As a bit of an outsider, as Merrijoy mentioned, I consider myself very lucky to have been welcomed into the Senior College fold. And I believe that we're all very lucky to be living here in Canada, where liberal democracy and common sense are still valued and defended. I want to explore with you today, as both David and Merrijoy said, how our government and how Canadians more generally have responded to these recent examples of real or threatened violations of international law, and how in each of these cases, the government was required to balance its interests versus its values. Jake Sullivan, a former senior official in the Barack Obama administration, and now a key foreign policy advisor to Joe Biden, said not too long ago that every US administration comes up short on the values versus interests question. Why? Because the charge of a president is to secure and safeguard the basic interests of the United States. And that requires engaging in geopolitics. And he continued, when you're engaging in geopolitics, you're inevitably pitting short-term security interests against long-term commitments to values. When a famous Hong Kong rock star turned political activist was asked if she had ever considered going into politics, she replied, "It's the job of politicians to learn to think inside certain constraints and to have to make moral calculations. I realized early on," she concluded, "that I wasn't suited to that game." When we refer to Canadian values and interests, what are we talking about? On the value side, for example, it's often the rule of law, good governance, free and fair elections, and human rights, including freedom of expression and freedom from unjust imprisonment. Canada's interests, on the other hand, include trade, political military alliances, protecting its citizens at home and abroad, and in some cases, getting reelected. It's also important in this context to remember that Canada is a middle power with limited hard power influence and only a modicum of trade-related throw weight. As a result, it has to play its cards carefully when confronting more powerful bullies with whom it has important commercial and/or political ties. So let's turn to some recent cases that required Canada to balance these two forces and see if they give us some clues as to how the government might react in the future. First up is the Khashoggi case, which involved the brutal assassination in Istanbul by Saudi officials of a Washington Post journalist and Saudi national named Jamal Khashoggi. It was by any standard completely beyond the bounds of international law and morality. Not only did the murder take place without charge, trial, or conviction, but it was carried out on another state's territory. It also followed a pattern of human rights abuses in Saudi Arabia and much criticism of the kingdom for its brutal tactics in the war in Yemen. After weeks of denial, the Saudi government admitted that its officials had carried out the Khashoggi murder. However, both the CIA and the UN Special Rapporteur who investigated the case concluded that Saudi Arabia's infamous crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, better known as MBS, knew of and likely ordered the assassination. Given all of the above, it might have been relatively easy for Canada, and frankly for the entire international community, to condemn the Saudi government and the Crown Prince personally, to demand a full accounting of those responsible, and to seek compensation for the victim's family. The second case involves Meng Wanzhou, the much in the news Chinese Huawei executive who was arrested by Canadian officials in Vancouver pursuant to a US extradition request. In response, and without charge or access to proper consular assistance, China detained two Canadians, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, and increased the sentence of two other Canadians in detention from a prison sentence to the death penalty. From Canada's perspective, these actions and the trade sanctions imposed by China that followed were clear violations of international law and of diplomatic practice. Our third case involves the 2014 Russian invasion and annexation of the Crimean Peninsula, an action that clearly contravened the UN Charter prohibition on violating the territorial integrity of another member state. In addition, an international inquiry determined that during the invasion, a Russian missile was responsible for downing a Malaysian Airlines plane, killing all 283 passengers and 15 crew on board. Finally, earlier this year, Israel's Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu threatened to annex up to 30% of the West Bank, a move that would have legitimized thousands of illegal Israeli settlements and left Palestinians with a disconnected Bantustan-like possibility of a state. Such actions also would have been in clear violation of international law, various United Nations Security Council resolutions, and a decision by the International Court of Justice. So, how did the Canadian government respond in each of these cases? Canada condemned the Khashoggi murder and applied targeted sanctions against the Saudi officials accused of carrying out the murder. It did not criticize or apply sanctions against the Crown Prince. For some time, it, quote, considered whether to cancel a contract with Saudi Arabia for the sale of light armored vehicles worth approximately $15 billion, but it never stopped delivering the vehicles and recently issued an export permit for them. When considering its response, the government no doubt had in mind a previous incident when our foreign minister tweeted criticism of the Saudi regime for its abuse of women's rights. In response, the Saudis expelled our ambassador and recalled its own, suspended trade and investment in Canada, and forced some 30,000 Saudi students studying in Canada to return home, a subject that we'll come back to at the end of my chat. In rather sharp contrast, in the main case, the government has steadfastly stuck to its principles and proceeded with the possible extradition of the Huawei executive on the basis of its obligations to uphold the rule of law and meet its treaty obligations to the United States. And it has done so despite significant pressure by China, by the families of the jailed Canadians, and by many prominent Canadian citizens. In response to Russia's actions in Crimea, Canada, led by its then Foreign Minister, Chrystia Freeland, who is a Ukrainian Canadian with strong ties to that country, condemned Russia's annexation as illegal. It joined with its G7 partners to expel Russia from the G8. It imposed sanctions on the energy and financial sectors in Russia, as well as asset freezes and prohibitions on dealing with a variety of Russian individuals and companies. In response to Israel's threatened annexation of parts of the West Bank, and after some pressure from former diplomats and some former ministers, the Prime Minister stated Canada's clear opposition to any unilateral annexation by Israel and restated the government's strong support for a negotiated two-state solution by Israel and the Palestinians. In the end, the threatened annexation did not proceed. I'd now like to turn very briefly to the responses to these same events, not by the government, but by Canadian citizens, you and me. Perhaps not surprisingly, Canadians' views have been all over the values versus interests map. On Ukraine, for example, there was little pushback. First, Ukrainian Canadians are a substantial and organized voting bloc in Canada. Second, our trade and economic interests with Russia are relatively small. Third, Russia's actions were a blatant violation of international law, and Vladimir Putin is viewed generally as a ruthless bully by many Canadians. So punishing Russia and Russians had little political, economic, or electoral cost. And finally, we were in very good company with our G7 partners. As a sidebar, you may recall Donald Trump hoped to invite Putin back into the G7, but so far has been thwarted in that effort. The Khashoggi murder and Saudi's other human rights violations provoked vastly different views from Canadians. One prominent Canadian academic argued that while canceling the armored vehicle contract would have little or no impact on Saudi Arabia's behavior, it would affect some 3,000 jobs in southwestern Ontario. Others, including some union workers whose jobs would have been negatively affected if the contract had been terminated, argued in favor of canceling it. For them, Canada's support for the protection of human rights was more important than the contract. Turning to the Munk affair, one Canadian international lawyer argued that when Canada received the US extradition request, it should have warned Mrs. Munk ahead of time not to enter the country. A former minister agreed. A former minister of justice, a former Supreme Court judge, and 20 prominent Canadians then argued in an open letter to the Prime Minister that Canada should ignore its treaty obligations with the United States, halt the ongoing legal proceedings, and engage in a prisoner swap with the Chinese. Others, myself included, have suggested that kowtowing to the Chinese on this case will only encourage more renegade behavior by China in the future. Indeed, China has made a practice of kidnapping the citizens of other countries with which it has disputes, including Australia, India, and Sweden. And it's unlikely that a swap by Canada is going to alter that pattern. In responding to Israel's threatened annexation, there were Canadians who focused on respect for the rule of law and the Palestinian right to self-determination. Within the Jewish community, there were those who believed in a greater Israel and supported the annexation, while many Canadians appeared to oppose the action as a move too far that might ultimately do Israel more harm than good. One aspect of both the Meng and the Khashoggi cases intrigued me, and given your current and past connections to the university, I thought you might find it of interest. I would have thought that historically, many in the academy, both professors and students, could have been counted on to back the values as opposed to the interest side of these conflicts. After all, students often tend to want to challenge entrenched privileges and support the underdog. And I assume, perhaps incorrectly, that most professors tend generally to be more liberal than conservative. To my surprise, however, in conversation with more than one academic and an unnamed university president, I encountered just the opposite. And why would that be? Because their interests, that is the approximately 640,000 international students that study at Canadian post-secondary institutions and pay hefty tuition fees, could seriously be impacted by both the Saudi and the Chinese governments unhappy with Canadian government criticism. Some academics ask me why the government doesn't just drop the extradition and why Canada arrested Meng in the first place. As noted, others seem to view the sale of arms to Saudi Arabia as a rather minor problem. If we don't sell to them, others will. To sum up, therefore, it seems that there are no easy answers to the dilemma of balancing values versus interests. On the surface, at least, the government appears to deal with each situation as a one-off. There are times when it's easy for the government to uphold its stated values, especially when its interests are not much threatened. Other times, they appear to take different positions on seemingly similar fact situations. For example, recently banning exports of certain weapons to our NATO partner, Turkey, but not to Saudi Arabia. Canadians, for their part, may be intensely interested in an issue and pressure the government from one or the other side. Alternatively, the government and its citizens may be ad idem. Sometimes we can be proud of our government's stance, other times not so much. So let me thank you for listening, and I'd now be very interested in your sage and experienced views on some of these questions. Thank you.
Thank you, John. We've